Okay, so this is the second part of the series of doing different trees. So I'm going to do an alder tree today. So I'm going to show you it in the distance and in the foreground, so you're going to get an idea. So I've got some water going on here. I've got a variety of colours in my palette, but I'm going to be using the raw sienna and the sap green and some raw umber here. So what I want to do now, so I've got round number 6, is take some of the raw sienna and some of the sap green and mix them together. So the green is a fairly light green and it's quite yellowy as well, so hence why I've added a little bit of raw sienna into that green. I'm using my round number 6 and you're just focusing on this tree shape. So you can start within the centre. The branches and foliage come up and out. So nice thick paint into a wet wash and it will do its thing. So it's really about learning the shapes of each of these trees and then being able to apply these different techniques when you need them. This is flowing lovely today. And rinse the brush off. Just dry that out. And then I'm going to use a little bit of raw umber. So it's a bit lighter than something like a sepia. It should work quite nicely. So I'm just going to bring a little bit in for a trunk. I'm still using my round number 6. Depending on how small I would go, I might even go down to a number 2. I've done this fairly big for a distant tree. But basically I'm popping in a few branches and trunk so you can see them through the tree. But it's all wet in wet, all working nicely. If you wanted one side to be darker than another, you just add more paint in there and you can always just soften in at the bottom. So that's the distant one. Then I'm going to look at a foreground one. So I would use a sponge. So natural sponge, lots of bobbly bits. I've wrung it out, I've dabbed it off on the kitchen towel. I'm going to pick up some of the paint. And I'm dabbing gently, but changing the sponge direction every single time. Starting at the bottom of the tree and working my way up. You'll find sponging uses a lot of paint, so be prepared to mix up a bit more. So that's my sap green and my raw sienna mix going in there. And then as you get further up, you're going to start to squeeze the sponge a little bit to start to make the shape that you need. You could could do this with stippling as well, with a soft brush, hog hair brush. This just gives a more sort of dappled effect, which this tree has got, whereas the hog hair brush gives a more dense effect. So that's why I've chosen a sponge over the hog hair brush this time. When you get to that point, then you've got a shape, a main shape there. You can start to add a little bit more density in places. So this is just dabbing in with around number 6. The paint's still quite wet, so it's going to flow. It's giving you an opportunity to add a little bit more detail, but when you're doing something like this, you want to keep it as random as possible. The temptation to dot all over will just make it look very, very flat. So less is always more. So I'm just building up the centre of the tree, adding a little bit of detail. You can just vary the pressure of your brush, and if you haven't quite captured some of those branches, you can just bring them out a little bit further. We've got a few more appearing. It's all about creating a little bit of variety in there. Then we're going to come back into the raw umber. And start to create the trunk. Then you can utilise some of the gaps that the sponge has created to start to pop some bits of dark in. So where it's white, you can pop a few little bits in for the trunk. Then as it becomes more dappled and there's more white, you can start to put a few branches in. So remember to just keep referring back to your pictorial reference. You want that to be as accurate as possible so that it helps you get a good representation of that tree, but it doesn't need to be copied. I'm going to pop in a little bit of sepia just down one side of the trunk. This now I'm using a rigger. Back into the raw umber. I can just start to create a few branches off the trunk. You can leave little gaps, some of them can come over. Remember that most of these branches now will come upwards as they come out. Occasionally you get a rogue one. It's quite nice to put an odd one in, but you want to keep them flowing upwards and outwards. If you look at your picture and see where you've got gaps so you haven't got floating bits. Remember, if you can stagger where they come off the trunk, it will look much more natural as well. then you can just soften in at the bottom again. So that one's an alder tree.